Let's continue here now. A mother of a 6-year-old girl from Kimberley in the Northern Cape who was raped allegedly by a 14-year-old boy says the justice system has failed them. This as the case against the boy was withdrawn after his psychological evaluation deemed him unfit to be held criminally liable.
It's alleged that the teenage boy led the young girl to a nearby veld where he then raped her. The mother of the 6-year-old rape survivor says all she wanted was justice.
It is sad because my daughter is not the same anymore. The alleged perpetrator is roaming the streets and my child sees him and gets scared. She's not safe, yet he is free.
She says her daughter is still traumatized by the incident.
She's struggling to concentrate at school, and now she even failed the year. This has affected her. As a result, we're constantly going to hospitals.
The 14-year-old alleged perpetrator was briefly incarcerated following the rape last year.
The case was laid before the prosecution, which requested that the boy be sent for psychological evaluation. The psychologist reported that the boy has a mental capacity of a 9-year-old and has no criminal capacity. On the basis of the report, the prosecution declined to prosecute and withdrew the case.
The family insists that they will not let this matter go and is seeking legal assistance to ensure justice is served. SABC News, Kimberley.
A director of the Teddy Bear Clinic, Dr. Shaheda Omar. Dr. Omar, a very good afternoon to you. A tragic story indeed. But please, as we know, in most, rape cases, one expects there to be justice. And in this case, when we start talking about justice, we're really talking about an arrest, in most situations. But in this case, we're talking about children. How then do we start even making sure that the girl does get justice while the boy is also protected because he is just also a boy?
So you're raising a very pertinent issue here. These are both children. The two pieces of legislation we need to recognize is the Children's Act 38 of 2005, and the focus there is looking at the best interest of the child. Now, both of these children are minors, and both of them, we need to look at what is in their best interest. The other piece of legislation is the Child Justice Act 75 of 2008, which speaks to diverting children away from the criminal justice system, children who have committed offenses and are in conflict with the law. The purpose around this is to give children a second chance in life where there's an opportunity for intervention, rehabilitation, and reintegration. We know throwing children into incarceration, into prisons, historically have created hardened criminals and so sophisticated perpetrators. So we speak to criminal capacity. The age of criminal capacity has been raised to 12 years. Children between the age of 12 and 14 are often evaluated and on the level of risk, whether it's a low risk, medium risk or high risk, where all opportunities for intervention are provided. In cases where that is not appropriate, where the child is uncontrollable, of course the child would then have to go through a different process. But in this case, we know that the 14-year-old's level of functioning, cognitive functioning, is that of a 9-year-old, and therefore the child does not have criminal capacity, which means does not have reasonable maturity to distinguish between right and wrong. And I think in the evaluation, often risk factors are identified and protective factors. And in this case, we're not actually sure about the adversities that this child may have been exposed to. So if we're looking in principle, both of these children are victims of some sort. Whether the child has been exposed to sexual behavior, whether the child has been a victim of sexual molestation himself. I think these are factors that need to be considered, and we cannot deny the fact that the victim has suffered, immensely and will continue to suffer and will require intensive therapy in order to learn to cope and, of course, reach out and trust people in the future. But we need to appreciate that we are looking at the best interests of both children and also giving the alleged, or I would say the initiator of sexual violence, a second opportunity in life. But the Child Justice Act also looks at victim-offender mediation, where the initiator of violence would be allowed an opportunity, not the initiator, but the victim would be allowed to question the initiator, and the initiator could actually apologize and make amends. Not that one can actually take away what has happened.
No, I mean, in this case, I'm not sure how much you heard of that previous clip that we just played, where this 6-year-old child was raped by this 14-year-old mother, saying there that the 14-year-old boy is still walking around the community. The child is traumatized every time she sees, this perpetrator, this 14-year-old. You talk about, interventions in terms of how can we remedy the situation. So how best can this mother of the 6-year-old remedy the situation in this case, because she does feel that justice was not served here for her 6-year-old?
Well, certainly seeing the initiator of violence repeatedly is secondary victimization and trauma. And, in light of the fact that he had committed the offense and he had violated the 6-year-old girl, he needs to be in an intervention program. And as I mentioned, regarding the level of risk, if it's a once-off isolated incident or multiple victims, one needs to evaluate. And despite the fact that he may be a low-level risk, he still needs to be into a program and ensure that he does not have any contact with this young girl who has suffered such immense trauma. And just seeing the perpetrator again would certainly open up those deep and raw wounds. And, one cannot actually minimize what the victim is feeling. So I think more stringent measures need to be put into place where the child is in a secure program, ensuring that he is not a risk to other children, and that once he has gone through the evaluation process after the interventions, only then can they decide that the child be released out into the open. But this young victim needs to go through a therapeutic process where she can come to the position of whether she would like to face this young boy or not.
Now, Dr. Omar, as the schools, open, we've, of course, heard, those horrible cases last year where, thousands of very young children fell pregnant while they were at school, some as young as 10 years of age. And as far as the Child Justice Act, how far does it protect children, or at least victims of rape, in as far as narrative is concerned, in as far as language is concerned? I'm saying this because we keep hearing this language that is very gendered natured and skewed against the girl child. Just recently, during some campaigns, in various provinces that I mentioned, Limpopo, as it is the recent one, where the MEC of Health was heard saying that, girls, or at least close your legs and open your books. I mean, that kind of language really one starts to think that this is skewed against the girl child in as far as she's the one that is to blame, when she is raped or when she is impregnated. But in actual fact, it is a case of statutory rape.
Indeed, and I think what we look at when we speak to the Child Justice Act, as I mentioned, the aim is actually to give children a second chance in life. But at the same time, they need to appreciate and recognize that actions have consequences. So a diversion program takes them through, cognitive behavioral interventions, challenging their distortions, their cognitive distortions of denial, awareness, impact, all responsibilities. They need to acknowledge responsibility. Only then do they go into a program. So I think we need to realize that the Child Justice Act is there to serve the purpose of both male and female, because we know that more likely victims are females, but there are female perpetrators or initiators of sexual violence, and we know that 43% of sexual offenses are committed by children against other children. However, we must not forget the Children's Act, because the Child Care Act speaks specifically to each and every child and to look at the risk levels. Is the child at risk? Is the child in need of care? And then those are factors that need to be considered, and with regard to that, only then can decisions be made whether a child is allowed to be, community-based intervention, or should the child be in an institution where they require intensive intervention before they are actually eligible to go back into the community.
How much are parents held to account at some level, or should they be held to account? I'm mentioning this because as we were talking about the rape in the Northern Cape, where the 6-year-old child was raped by this 14-year-old child who's now acquitted, does one then start to interrogate the kind of background, that a 14-year-old child whose mental capacity is that of a 9-year-old child is able to enact such a crime on a 6-year-old? Do we then start to look at the home that they come from and start interrogating what kind of upbringing they're being subjected to?
So I think it would be premature to say, that it's just the home environment. There might be many other contributory factors. One needs to look at the broader social context and environment of this perpetrator, of this initiator of sexual violence. Has he been exposed to other forms of abuse, be it sexual abuse, physical abuse? Has he been exposed to pornography? Has he himself been victimized? But I hear what you're saying in terms of parents' rights and responsibilities. It is the responsibility of each and every parent to ensure that their children are aware of safe and unsafe touches, acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. The responsibility begins at home, and I think that is something that needs to be reinforced, especially with cognitively challenged children, where they may not always be in a position to process the information, but also just to not to alarm you, but to make you aware that we've had children as young as 5 and 6 years old who have attempted penetration and have been instrumental in full-blown penetration. So it's all about the risk factors. One needs to contextualize where it's coming from, because there are many facets where children could be influenced from.
When we start to speak about justice, and as we wrap up our conversation, Dr. Omar, a lot of people have come out saying very strongly that as it sits now and as it stands now, justice is really not in favor of the victims, and it really is, the legal framework as it is now is really for the perpetrators. What's been your observation?
Well, as far as adults is concerned, yes, certainly I would support that it's more about the perpetrators' rights, but we're not talking about adults, we're talking about children, and we need to look at their cognitive capacity, look at the criminal capacity, and look at the pattern, duration, frequency, and severity of the behavior before we can decide and make a decision that the child has to be incarcerated. But looking at victims' needs, we must not dismiss that or deny that, because that is also a reality that needs to be addressed.
All right, Dr. Omar, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Dr. Shaheda Omar from the Teddy Bear Clinic there, of course, speaking to us of the back of that rape where a 6-year-old little girl was raped by a 14-year-old boy in the Northern Cape. The case has since been dismissed.